Tony Blair got up every morning and he knew what his political mission was. You can say that about Thatcher, you can say that about Brown or Theresa May, even if they were less successful. With Starmer, it's never been clear whether it's an oppositional government, whether he has that.
Starmer's Director of Communications didn't know that he'd have a job until 4 p.m. of polling day itself, which was why there was literally no plan for what he would do on the day that he won.
From the outside, from the cabinet, it looks like he is being manoeuvred around by the right of the Labour Party. Does he know he's being manoeuvred around, or is he like sort of, well, that's the deal I made?
It is true that they actually had not populated even the first week with any detail as to what they would do, and I don't think we really understand how that was allowed to happen.
Love podcasts, hate nonsense. The Politics Show podcast, ladies and gentlemen. Come on! Ava Santina, how are we?
Do you think that the lack of clapping was zero endorsement? It was like a...
Sorry, I didn't realise we were allowed to clap.
We report without fear or favour.
Yeah, sorry.
We can't throw our weight behind that.
But there we go, another round of applause.
We are not pro-nonsense.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good to make that clear from the start. And you can always tell when a guest sort of how they respond to the intro. It does reveal about their own personal politics. And we have been taking notes, gentlemen. Ava, we're joined by Patrick Maguire, political correspondent for The Times, and Gabriel Pogrund, Whitehall editor of The Sunday Times. Those are the people we're talking about in the abstract. They're sat to my right. Chaps, how are we? We okay?
All the better for being here in a studio I've seen so much of over the years.
Now sat in it.
I know.
Making content.
Finally cool, I think. Not quite.
Ava's the judge of that.
Nonce is quite an integral part of your book.
Yeah, we got it in the Times, I think, for the first time in a Times headline ever.
And a BBC.
Yeah, Laura
Yes.
Ginsburg is saying nonce.
She uttered those words.
She panicked. And she did say before, didn't she, like, you can beep this out, I'm going to say it. Like,
Yeah.
warm up.
In my mind, I mean, the BBC's legal team are pretty risk-averse, but there was a bit of a sense among all the different organisations within the Fourth Estate that if Prince Andrew wants to sue us, fucking bring it on. Let's call him a nonce. So that's what happened.
Let him come. The challenge was laid down. Yeah, it's something quite uniquely British, isn't it? The sort of relishing calling your opponents, be they political or otherwise, nonces is just a unique thing to us. And Elon Musk as well. We were talking about that on the last record, actually. Who I forgot. I didn't realise that he won that defamation case. That he was allowed to call the cave diver pedo guy.
Yeah. Because he said when he was younger, he used to always get called pedo guy.
Wow.
I wouldn't. Yeah.
Fantastic defence.
Waterboard that information out of me. We are here to talk about your book, chaps.
Thank you very much. Getting the inside story of Labour under Starmer.
There it is. I would say the authoritative account, the first draft of history. Would we call it that?
I think we've gone for definitive.
Yeah. Okay. Something more modest.
We can't quite lay claim to first. That's just on a factual basis. There have been some others. We won't mention them by name over here. We hope to be definitive.
Got you.
Someone beat you to putting out like the Starmer tome before. Well, I mean, he's only been in government for 6 months.
Yeah, I guess you could say Tom Baldwin's paperback. Have you got it?
No,
Tom
sorry.
Paperback?
That's Baldwin and
Mark Steers
yes,
on England.
On England, but not quite Baldwin himself.
Well, Tom Baldwin's paperback of his biography tells a bit of the story of the election. And that's a very good book on Keir the man. But we have chosen to do the sort of recent history of the Labour Party as like a living, breathing, very messy organism / extended dysfunctional family.
And I guess the latest in an esteemed tradition as well of Rawnsley, of Shipman, of these kind of...
I'm so glad you mentioned Rawnsley. Nobody ever mentions Rawnsley. Everyone's always like Shipman. And
a real Rawnsley head.
Yeah, Tim's a colleague and great mentor and friend of at least Gabriel's. I wouldn't... I would just say I wouldn't presume to call Tim my friend.
Of course. Yeah, no.
You know, if he thinks I am, then great. But no, Rawnsley invented the genre, I think.
Yeah, and these kind of books that sort of they detail what happened, but they give you an insight as well, or in Starmer's case, maybe the lack of the ideas, the politics, the guiding forces. And then they often get serialised as well on the front pages of the Sunday Times and elsewhere, and it's a nice little ecosystem you've got going on. So, should we talk about the subject?
Accusing them of insider trading.
Is that an attack?
It's not an attack at all.
Do I get my right to reply?
No. I genuinely, I've always thought about it when the economics of it, right? Of being a reporter, of doing the hard yards of print, of doing broadcast, everything that it involves, and then writing an effectively definitive book on the subject matter, how you get the time. And I always admired Shipman for the way in which he would kind of combine the reporting he was doing with hundreds of hours of sort of background research, and then combine the two to feed into each other. So the scoop on the front page of the ST would inevitably possibly have come from his book research, and the two connected to each other.
Cross-pollination.
Exactly.
I do want to say as well, on the topic of this ecosystem, now that you've said definitive, as of this afternoon, if you go on Amazon for the page for our book, it will say definitive Joe. It's going to say that now.
You guys, every interview, you've baited the hook and gone, well, we call it definitive. I don't know if you would. And everyone's declined the opportunity to do so. Dugmore, the schmuck.
How would you
has fallen
pronounce
for it.
DEFIN? Yeah.
Okay, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about the book. Let's talk about what's in it.
I guess the biggest difference about this book compared to the Tom Baldwin biography, if you can call it that, is that this isn't really about Starmer. It's more about Morgan McSweeney. And for anyone who's got their head under a rock, could you tell us who that is?
Morgan McSweeney is the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. He is from Macroom in Cork, which Irish viewers may know or think is a dump, apparently. He is the person with whom our book starts. It's 40 or so pages before you meet Keir Starmer. And that's because Morgan McSweeney had a project and had a sort of timeline long before Keir Starmer. He met Keir Starmer, or Keir Starmer started thinking seriously about the leadership. He came to the UK at 17, lived with his aunt, was a bit of a slacker, had lived on a kibbutz for a bit, used to have dreadlocks by all accounts. I'm not sure whether dreadlocks are important. Yeah.
That's incredibly
he had ginger
important.
dreadlocks and was quite grungy, apparently.
It's esteemed colleague.
Very different to the sort of image he projects now, which is very clean cut. And he came to the UK, sort of joined the Labour Party on a whim in 1998 after the Good Friday Agreement, got a job working on reception at Labour HQ. Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair now say we have no idea who this guy was. It gets written up as, Alan Milburn or Tony Blair or Peter Mandelson saw him on the desk and said, I'm going to make you a star, kid.
Actually, I like the cut of this kid's gym. Yeah.
Actually, they didn't know who he was. He was a sort of election organiser in the noughties. And what was happening in the noughties? Well, he was going out into the country and people were saying, we don't like New Labour anymore. And he came to The View as he was, watching the news to the Lib Dems in Brent or the BNP in Barking, or, was watching Lambeth Council swing back to Tory rule after many years of Labour being in the mud in Lambeth because of the legacy of the hard left, but also New Labour coming back and taking the council back and failing as well. So every version of Labour had failed in Lambeth. He basically came to the conclusion that the Labour Party was speaking to itself. And whether it was the left of the Labour Party or the Blairite right of the Labour Party, they didn't get what people were really, really, really animated by. And so he set about trying to fix that. And the challenge became all the more urgent for him in the Corbyn years, which, we should say in the interest of fairness, Morgan McSweeney was one of the unwitting midwives of as the campaign manager for Liz Kendall's 4.5% landslide. But yeah, so by sort of 2015, 2017, he's running an organisation called Labour Together, which, despite the name, as we write in the book, was a massive deception. It was interested in polling the Labour membership so it could find a way to convince them to get rid of the Corbynites. And eventually that worked. And it worked because they found the right candidate, who was one Sir Keir Rodney Starmer QC.
Was Starmer always the man for this splinter group faction Labour Together? Was it a match made in heaven, or was it kind of politically convenient for these two different groups to kind of come together and go, oh, do you know what, actually Starmer might be the guy that works for us, and Starmer likewise saw some machinery, logistical operation that could be to his benefit in pursuing the leadership?
It's a really great question. I think we've fallen back on this phrase once or twice, that McSweeney had a machine but no candidate, and Starmer was the candidate without a machine. And the story of the last half decade in Labour politics has been the coming together of those two distinct individuals, but also the coalitions that they represented. I mean, McSweeney was very clinical in the way that he contemplated Labour politics. He did something that very few people had done in the period of Corbyn's leadership, which was he spent hundreds of thousands of pounds, I mean, money that is generally unheard of in British politics, polling the Labour membership, slicing it, dicing it, segmenting it, trying to understand who it was. Because let's not forget, there are a lot of members of the Parliamentary Labour Party who'd be hyperventilating on Newsnight about how the party was deluged by trots and freaks. And, notwithstanding whether or not there were some of those, there was also quite a large contingent of the membership which was disenfranchised, felt alienated from the party because of Iraq, because of the Labour Party shift to the centre. They wanted a better world. They felt that the financial crisis demanded a different and new politics. And what McSweeney was trying to do was understand, well, how much do those people constitute? How much do the hard left constitute? How much do the right constitute within the membership? Because without understanding that, we've got no prospect of prizing the party away from the Corbynites once he goes. We should also say, by the way, that he never believed that Labour was a spent force. Tony Blair spent quite a lot of this time contemplating the prospect of a British en marche. McSweeney shared that loathing of the hard left. Patrick alluded to the fact that he developed his politics in Lambeth, which under the reign of Red Ted Knight had presided over an appalling child abuse scandal. And McSweeney sort of in his own mind drew a very direct line between the indulgence and exoticism of hard left politics, but this idea that the left were preoccupied by their intellectual games and no longer reckoning with the reality of what was going on around them or prioritising the people they were supposed to represent. I mean, he hated the left, but he always thought the party could be saved, so he set about analysing it. And by 2019, he had a bit of a formula. He had three big groups that, in his mind, the Labour Party made up. The idealists, those are the people I was speaking about a few moments ago, trade unionists, people that want a better world. Ideologues, the hard left, and then the instrumentalists or the realists, basically the Blairites. He thought that the idealists were the kingmakers. If you could win them over, you could win the leadership. And he saw that Starmer had two things. Firstly, he could win over the idealists because he'd been loyal to Corbyn. He could appeal to the same sense that had fueled Corbyn's improbable victories in 2015 and 16, which was, the world can be a better place. He cribbed John McDonnell's slogan for his own leadership campaign, another future is possible. And he thought that Starmer could, in due course, win power in the country. We quote McSweeney uttering this line, Corbyn sympathised with terrorists, Keir locked them up. He thought his CV at the CPS gave him a unique ability to reach out into the country. But first he had to reach out to the membership, and that was what he codified in this PowerPoint he showed to donors back in 2017 called Operation Red Shield. He very, very deliberately was planning to win the party back, and he was very, very deliberately looking for a candidate, and that is what eventually propelled him into Starmer's hands.
I'd like to come back to that point about hating the left, because there was a really good economist, Duncan Robinson, piece about hippie punching that if we have time we should talk about. But Ava, I guess this point about who the Labour membership was at that moment in time, you can kind of pass over the fact that this groundswell of new people joining the party, getting up to about 500,000 people, I think, towards its peak, going, actually, we don't know who the fuck any of these people are. And quite often, and you found this when you were reporting at a Reform event recently, a lot of the young people there were saying to you, I was a Corbyn supporter. I was an economic populist. And you wouldn't, I think the stereotypical assessment of who those people were that were joining the party, most people would have said, there's no chance any of those people would ever be reform curious or sympathetic. But actually, unless you do the polling, you don't have a clue who they are. You don't know what their politics are. You don't know whether they're ideologues, idealists, or realists, do you?
Sure. When you were talking there about Sweeney's involvement in Lambeth and rooting out the hard left, he also was very involved in Barking and rooting out the sort of fascist hard right there. Do you think that he drew a parallel? Because what you're talking about there is the Reform supporters, and I suppose the link there between Corbyn and someone like Farage is, populism. Do you think that Sweeney strategised or saw a parallel between those two factions.
Yeah, I think that probably, if he had one analysis, it would be that both politics were in some ways untethered from reality. So the BNP in 2006 was propagating the conspiracy theory that the Labour government was paying Africans to relocate to Barking. And in Lambeth, Ted Knight was twinning the local authority with Nicaragua and refused to fly the British flag from the town hall, describing it as the apron of the butcher. I mean, I think McSweeney would say basically both politics was so monumentally divorced from the everyday needs of people they were elected to represent that, by appealing to that, by trying to root politics again in service, there was a way of countering those populist forces. Obviously, it's very easy in principle, but he walked around the Becontree estate in Dagenham, fly tipping, mattresses dumped on the streets, sort of place where, talk about smashed windows.
He shouldn't have been doing all of that, to be honest.
Yeah, terrible behaviour from Morgan. Yeah, disgusting stuff.
He was throwing bricks in windows. It was insane. No, but it was a place where that wouldn't be addressed, and his view was, well, you address that, and we can address the causes of populism.
And I think it was less a case of him seeing moral equivalence between the left and the right in this case. I think his real beef with people to his left during that period was that he thought the way they took on the BNP was ineffective, i.e. it involved, and lots of people who were there in the noughties will say this is an outrageous thing to say, for an argument for him to make, because they were there, they took on the fascists, etc., etc. But his view was that turning up in East London and saying no pass around was was counterproductive. Now none of us were there, sadly, in Barking in the noughties, so it's quite hard to pinpoint whatever. And it's true that it wasn't just, it's important not to flatten this history because there were lots of people who were taking on the BNP during that period. But it's certainly true that what Morgan McSweeney thought was actually the way to do it was to tackle the factors that were driving people towards the BNP, i.e. cleaning up their gardens, having a go at making the council take on absentee landlords, who lived in big houses in Essex and were letting houses to too many, basically slum landlords. So it's a sort of tricky thing to diagnose, but certainly his analysis was the way the left, both the sort of centre left and the radical left, had taken on the BNP was not addressing the root causes of their electoral success. And some people say what happened in 2010 subsequently was a result of the BNP imploding once it's been on the national stage. But it's true that in 2010 the BNP lost all of its seats in Barking and Dagenham. So someone was doing something right.
I guess.
Can I add to that, because that chimes in with what he had to say about Lisa Nandy, right? Which is why they were losing why Labour were hemorrhaging working class voters. Lisa Nandy was very much the no gender, no borders, no queen sort of line of thinking or line of politicking. And is that's sort of why he believed that voters were fleeing the Labour Party, because they weren't concerned with the cleaner gardens, cleaner streets, no fly tipping, that sort of thing.
And just this feeling that the Labour Party, and this isn't even a critique of Corbynism per se, it's a critique of, basically everybody to the left of to the left of the right of the Labour Party, everyone to the left of the Labour Party centre, and just the Labour establishment's way of thinking, which was it was sort of preoccupied with the sorts of causes and campaigns that if you were going home for Christmas dinner as a student and mentioned one at the table, people would roll your eyes at them. People would roll their eyes at it. And that quote, Lisa Nandy saying, no gender, no borders, no queen, is about a series of positions she'd taken in the 2020 leadership campaign, i.e., she'd signed the pledge for Labour's campaign for trans rights, which Keir Starmer didn't do. She was very pro-migration, and she was an avowed Republican.
So the monarchy should be slimmed down.
Yeah, exactly. And so hence that very withering tricolon from Morgan McSweeney.
Put it on a diet plan, the monarchy. Slim it right down. Weight Watchers for the monarchy.
Exactly.
But this is really, I feel like there's a through thread here which characterises tons of discussions within the Labour Party or just within left-wing politics generally, which is about power, right? And it's all very well and good having these moralising positions, but unless you have your hands on the levers of power, having a right on opinion is worth nothing. And the response, I guess, goes, well, if you get into power but you don't have any ideas, what is your guiding philosophy once you get in there, and how do you know that you're on the right path, right? And we cut back and forward between the two. But from what you guys are saying about McSweeney, it seems to me that you are seeing that there very much is a political ideology there. There is a baseline of thought. You can call it a vision, whatever you like, whatever you want to project onto it.
There's a critique, and this is a big question. I think that you get to the end of our book. Sorry, not trying to not sell it. You get to the end of our book, and that's still a big question.
Yeah.
And this is something I think people who work with Morgan McSweeney would still ask, which is what is it all for? He has a very refined and very trenchant critique of the left of the Labour Party, of the mushy middle of the Labour Party, even of his colleagues on the right of the Labour Party. But that does not amount to a fully formed politics with a positive proposition in it. And you see this in the way people are talking about Blue Labour at the minute, which is a movement that Morgan McSweeney has links to. So much of it is basically, if I may use a phrase that your podcast listeners, if I may get down with the kids for a second, it's about triggering the libs, right? It's not about, the whole point of Blue Labour is meant to be, right on culture, left on economics. You get less of the left on economics sort of positive proposition and worldview thing. And I think that comes through, like Morgan McSweeney has always been the first to spot where people are going wrong and can formulate a sort of operational plan to overcome it or whatever. In terms of the sort of political substance and the political philosophy, I think it's fair to say that comes from other people throughout this.
What do you guys think it's all for then? If you know, that is the question that maybe the answer isn't there. Do you have working theories? Like, what is it?
Well, look, I think in a way you might say it's a category error to ask that question, because what has McSweeney dedicated much of his life to? It's been winning power within the Labour Party. So it's sort of the question of what you do when you get power is secondary to, well, how do you seize the levers of power within the party itself? And we have to remember as well that he founded Labour Together in 2017 when Corbyn was at his zenith. He'd been addressing the crowd at Glastonbury. It looked like the left had been changed indefinitely. We slightly, I'm not sure I'd say foolishly, but very sincerely, if incorrectly, said in our last book that Corbyn had changed the left forever, and that it would never return.
He was here to stay.
He was here to stay. Corbyn and Corbynism.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, even then, when he had sort of subjected the Labour Party bent the Labour Party to his politics, he'd suspended Corbyn, he'd removed Corbynism from the body politic of the party. Even then, his principal objective was to bring the party back into government. He was a sort of psephologist and electoral strategist. So I think, in a way, the fact we're answering this question underscores the extent to which Starmer himself has yet to articulate an answer to that question. And traditionally, it would fall to him or the Chancellor to do so. And we're seeing a little bit more of that with Reeves at the moment, with growth being a kind of governing philosophy. But in a way, it's almost ridiculous. It would be like asking what was Ed Llewellyn's governing philosophy under David Cameron. I mean, obviously, we do live in an era of chiefs of staff who are conspicuous by their presence, Dominic Cummings being an example. But really, I'm not sure I would answer the question without outlining that caveat. And as Patrick says, Blue Labour politics, it's always been very clear what it is not for. Maurice Glassman, who's a great character in the book, the son of a toy maker from Hackney, Jewish northeast Londoner, he was came to prominence during Ed Miliband's leadership and gave voice to this idea that Miliband was, incomprehensibly and ridiculously out of touch with the people he was supposed to represent. But yeah, what you do when you appeal to those people's cultural values and when you sound and look like them, but what is it then for, is a question I'm not sure I could discreetly address.
Because you talk about at the beginning, the opening of the book, there's this sort of like insatiable side to Sweeney and Starmer. They win the election, they win this landslide election, but they're not happy with the number of seats that they've won. They're like, it's not quite 97. And then you have later in the book them getting into government and they're talking about the grid being empty. They actually haven't got like anything concrete that they can start getting on with. So do you think that the strategy with Labour for this election was ridding the party of Corbyn and getting into government and then perhaps they were at a cliff edge once they got there.
Yeah, and I think it was telling that for a year, Starmer's team was set up in this really strange way, where you had Morgan McSweeney responsible for campaigns and Sue Gray responsible for preparing for government, as if that was a totally apolitical, unconnected to the business of winning an election or what you might say to the electorate sort of thing. Or the idea that government itself is not political and it's about the political judgments you take. You know, who are we going to fight for? Who is going to pay for this? Who's going to win under us? Who's going to lose? Who are our people as a Labour government? The fact that those two things were divorced, as you say, Eva, says something quite profound about this project, which is to say so much of it was about winning the election. And then what came after, I think there was an assumption that probably started with Keir Starmer, hence the recruitment of Sue Gray, the idea that you could, once you're in office, sort of dispense with politics and be like, whew, I hate politics, says Keir Starmer.
Thank God that's over.
Yeah. You know, I can move on, I can finally get back behind the desk and be a technocrat, and I'll be more competent and everything will be fine. I think they very quickly learned that that wasn't going to cut it. And that Morgan McSweeney was going to have to, as the guy who'd set so much of the political tone and the electoral strategy, I think there was a reluctance on his part to sort of go studs up and take control of the government, having never worked on Whitehall before, having ever only worked within the Labour Party, basically. But the fact that, as you say, they turned up, they didn't really know what they were doing, they didn't trust each other. It says something about how Keir Starmer conceives of politics and conceives of government. And I think you're only seeing this is why the government, I think, is having this weird process where it's sort of trying on a range of different political identities in public now. You know, is Keir Starmer the guy who praises Margaret Thatcher? Is he a blue Labour guy, etc., etc.? It's because that should be innate to a sort of prime minister. You know, Tony Blair got up every morning and knew what he was doing. You know, not knew what he was doing. He knew what his political mission was. You can say that about Thatcher, you can say that about Brown or Theresa May, even if they were less successful. With Starmer, it's never been clear whether it's an oppositional government, whether he has that, or whether, you know, the act of, you know, being prime minister, you know, you have a box or you have things across your desk, and it's not like you can subordinate everything to sort of like bureaucratic logic. You're having to make instinctive political judgments on absolutely everything, and that's a process that's very new to Keir Starmer. So. And that I do think comes back from A, his lack of political identity, but B, you know, Morgan McSweeney and the people around him were first and foremost electioneers. Morgan Jones is a very good Labour journalist, has this great phrase calling them Clause 1 socialists, Clause 1 of the Labour Party constitution being, you know, we exist to win elections. And, you know, people like Morgan McSweeney, Holly Ridley, the party's general secretary, is a very influential character in this book. Lots of the advisors around Morgan McSweeney were primarily concerned with winning, be that beating another faction in the Labour Party or winning elections. What came afterwards, you know, that was for the people to worry about. And given that they got Sue Gray to worry about it, over there at the other end of the corridor, we're not going to speak to her, we can't stand her, it's no surprise that the first 100 days wound up as they did.
By the way, I mean, I do think a question mark which hovers over not only the book but the government, as Patrick has outlined, is, well, what are Keir's politics? You know, is it possible that he's concealed them from us, but that at some point the mask slips or he rips it off and says, I'm a blue Labour guy, you know, I'm going to introduce, you know, blue Labour, I ought to have said a few moments ago, I mean, it's not just about disavowing people with Palestine badges on their New York tote bags. It's also had some policy substance. I mean, there were, under Miliband's tenure, actually, there's a lot of communitarianism at the heart of it. The idea we should get workers onto the boards of football clubs. If we can do that, maybe we could introduce something similar for large corporations as well. I mean, there were some interesting ideas attempting to sort of reconcile socialism, capitalism. There was a communitarian edge, and in some ways, you know, you might think that Starmer would lean into that, given the extent to which he's deferred to McSweeney on questions of electioneering. But early in the book, actually, we depict this phase where Starmer on Monday mornings was attending strategy meetings at the home of Jenny Chapman, a fellow member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Him and his advisors would troop into her house on Monday mornings, and they'd leave separately. They'd stagger their departures in order to conceal the fact, when they arrived in Westminster, that they'd all been together plotting Starmer's path to power. And we spoke to people who were in that first meeting, and they said that Starmer not only didn't want to chair the meeting, and he didn't chair it, by the way, but he also didn't want to talk about politics. He wanted to talk about adherence to trade union legislation and campaign finance regulations. And he is somebody who I think on some level believes that by being competent, by being effective, you can sort of master politics, and that you can decontaminate it of ideology and just do that which needs to be done. It might be the party as well got high on their own supply in their critique of the Tories, that, it's all sleaze, and basically Boris Johnson is a moral aberration. And as long as we're decent and competent, then politics will fix itself. And I suppose the mismatch between that and the government's trajectory so far is the ultimate tension. And I'm no philosopher, but they do say that sometimes the simplest explanation is the likeliest, and I think we've spent a lot of time searching for that politics in Starmer, and it might be that it just does not exist.
Go on, yeah.
So there's a quote in the book about sitting Keir Starmer at the front of a DLR train, which for listeners who aren't in London and don't know, there are these kind of the tram-like tube services that have a window at the front, and I quite like to sit in the front carriage because you get to feel like you're driving a train. But obviously there are no controls. You are just a passenger on the train. And obviously the quote that you guys get, it's basically saying that Starmer has been put there and to feel like he's in control, but he isn't. And there's also a slew of other kind of quite aggressive, undermining briefing, shall we say?
Well, calling him like a pawn at one point, right? Is it something like
the chess game?
Yeah.
Well, and that was from an advisor within government who is not necessarily aligned with the centre of Number 10, but, is a government advisor who said the eternal mystery of Keir Starmer to them is, from the outside, from the cabinet, it looks like he is being manoeuvred around by the right of the Labour Party. By that I don't just mean Blairites, I mean the sort of old right of the Labour Party, the sort of more culturally conservative, that sort of crowd, Labour first rather than progress to get into the alphabet super Labour's factions. But he, like that sort of question was, does he know he's being manoeuvred around, or is he like well, that's the deal I made, that I've subcontracted politics to these guys who like it and are better at it than me, and provided I'm winning the chess game, that's fine by me. That is how some people in government see it. And the DLR thing, again, it's sort of the question in all of this is it's very easy to say, God, these people around Keir Starmer or in government are saying the Prime Minister is sat at the front of a driverless train. But the big question is, okay, but maybe the Prime Minister has at some point just said, especially if you accept the view that he is a barrister and he's looking for different briefs, or, he just wants a Labour government. He wants to win and everything else is secondary, and he doesn't like the grubby business of politics. Maybe at one point he decided to get on the DLR. You know what I mean? It's sort of, he just thought, if...
Canning Town, let's go.
Well, no, totally. Let's go to that nice Russian banya in Canning Town, maybe.
What do you mean?
I'm going next week.
Are you actually?
Brother,
yes.
yeah.
It's quite the place. You have to bring citrus fruits with you.
Really?
What?
Yeah. And they have, you can get schmeist as well. They slap you around.
Oh, do they do it there? That was our big
foliage.
question, yeah. The
I
birch.
did it up in Hoxton the other week. Yeah, you get really whacked with leaves.
Yeah.
Was that one of the hipster ones?
I don't know. It's called like the Banya. I think maybe it's the same.
It's a similar thing. There's one in the Docklands that is like 25 quid a go, and it has the aesthetic. I haven't been, so I'm projecting, but it has the aesthetics. I think it's open quite late. It feels like it's providing restorative practices to like cabbies working through the weekend that go in there, get a steam, and then go back.
Yeah, I must confess, I'm part of the gentrification of that. I mean,
Nice.
Patrick and I, we don't want to make it sound like we did all of our book research in a sauna, but we're both apparently very familiar with that place, and therefore Canning Town DLR station.
Yeah,
But-
okay. And so
Can I just clarify? I've never actually been. It's just
You need to, bro.
It's just I will, but it's just sort of like a cultural signifier. I know.
Do we not think it's mad? We're talking about a prime minister less than a year into his tenure with a colossal majority, and we're going, is he even in control? Like that's
I'm still
crazy.
thinking about the banya. I'm just thinking. I'm thinking that my granddad once brought home a box of bananas off the docks to my nan, and my uncle has like a big white streak because a tarantula crawled out of it. I'm just imagining telling my granddad that everyone's going to the Banya now at the Docklands, and it used to be like a shipyard.
Yeah, there's one
Straight
there.
from SOAS to the Banya.
Yeah.
There's one in. I think there's one in Belgravia as well. There's a sliding scales, right, of where you can get beaten with birch. You're confirming you can get a good birching in the Docklands one.
You can. People actually have lockers where they store their
So you bring your own birch.
scrubs
They
and
keep their own-
sponges and
Really?
stuff. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting because we were concerned. We were going to go to that one, and then we were like, "But what happens if we can't get birched?" Which is
Can we,
what we want.
Can we go back to something that you were talking about earlier?
We're getting back to the subject matter.
No,
possibly.
sorry. Let's talk about their comm strategy. So Starmer is leading into Labour conference, and I suppose he is on a bit of a high. He's doing quite well in the polls. The Tories are tanking, and then he delivers this catastrophic line about Israel. He says that Israel has the right to defend herself, and Israel has the right to cut off water. Councillors start resigning. And then we start to see, well, at the next election, we see seats like Wes Streeting's Ilford North seat nearly lost. And Jonathan Ashworth loses his seat also in Leicester. And
Jess
that
Phillips
is
gets pushed as well, doesn't she?
Jess Phillips gets pushed. And it's
Shabbat
all
Ahmed,
about
yeah.
this. It's all about the Israel-Gaza conflict. Why do you think that happened? How did that line get so bungled? And as you report in your book, it takes him 4 days to actually address it properly or to offer any form of apology. Why does that happen?
I think it's an important question, and I'm just going to start by saying that one of the critiques of books like ours is that we view history through the prism of advisors, and that's a sort of decision. And we don't acknowledge it's a decision out loud, but we decide to view history through McSweeney's eyes, and we are elevating him in so doing. We've outlined at some length, I'd say, why we feel justified in having done that. But this really is one of the moments where you feel Starmer himself looms over the story. So we have been endowed with thousands of WhatsApps from within the leader's office depicting how they responded to that event. And you mentioned the LBC interview where he appeared to say that Israel had the right to engage in the collective punishment of Gazans, and then Emily Thornberry added insult to injury the following day on Newsnight, where she didn't appear to have a position on that. And the surface level analysis would be, well, they didn't have a comms strategy. But really, I think the reality is they didn't have a position to give, because I don't think Starmer felt that they needed to. And that's because while David Lammy was on these WhatsApps saying, yeah, Emily Thornberry's been given a real roasting on Newsnight, we've got to change position. Vidya Alaxon, one of his officials in Downing Street were saying we need to show more empathy. That word kept coming up. But you really feel at this point in the story that Starmer himself has decided, morally, we've got to stand by the Jewish state. We've got to stand by the United States. I don't mind the noise. I'm happy to have the arrows in my back. This is one of those moments where you feel like there's a bit of a conviction politician in Starmer, and it is visceral for him. I can't say why. Naturally, we're not here doing armchair psychoanalysis as to why he feels that so strongly, but there are a few moments in this story where it feels like Starmer just has a total and unbending conviction in a position. That was one of them. I mean, there are a lot of his own team, especially those we might associate with the Labour right, who also believe, well, when European allies were starting to shift, when NATO allies were starting to shift on the question of a ceasefire, surely Starmer would do the same. And I think morally, but also politically, he felt that until the United States gave him the off-ramp, he was not going to shift. Patrick's spoken before about the fact that Starmer is quite an experiential politician too. On October 7th, he spoke to Merav Michaeli, the leader of the Israeli Labour Party, who was in a bunker. And I think he just really felt like what is going on is intolerable, and we're going to back Israel come what may. And that's not to say whether that's right or wrong, but I think that is what essentially happened in that period. And obviously it totally fragmented the left come the election of 2024. Maybe there was some complacency that they could withstand that there was no other show in town, that Muslim voters will ultimately come back to Labour. Obviously that didn't come to pass, but it was very much emanated from Starmer himself.
Maybe shades of Corbyn in that stubbornness, in that strength of conviction that, when you would look at previous Labour leaderships, you would say Corbyn the true believer, McDonnell the pragmatist. And in the same sense, whether it's about this instance here or any of the others that you've just mentioned, where he does turn up to have that conviction that maybe I don't want to overstretch the similarities between the two because I think they're few and far between. But maybe there is some common ground between the two there, Patrick.
No, I think that's definitely right. In that, when Keir Starmer is convinced of the rectitude or the morality of a decision, what you see is he is incredibly hard to shift, and Gaza was definitely one of those. For a long time, despite the many representations he's getting from Muslims in the Labour Party, not least Shabana Mahmood, who was Shadow Justice Secretary, now Justice Secretary, only Muslim in the Shadow Cabinet, was basically saying, come on, like, notwithstanding the solidarity the Labour Party is showing to the Israeli people, to the Jewish people, British Muslims, who are a big part of Labour's core vote, or at least were, are, saying the opposite, and we need to do something out here. And
I think she wept when she saw him.
And answered.
She did. She wept. Really, when she saw Starmer?
Yeah. Well,
Wow.
Because just the weight of being the only Muslim in the Shadow Cabinet, I think, was very. It was
extraordinary pressure.
Wow.
Extreme pressure to have to, and also to spend an entire career, I think, wanting to some extent, escape that label, and not be defined by it, and then suddenly bearing all that responsibility on behalf of the community would have been very tough. But when Starmer's convinced of a position, he's very hard to move, a bit like Jeremy Corbyn. But unlike Jeremy Corbyn, he doesn't stay on that hook. He may move 3 months, 6 months later than everyone wants him to move. He may be completely opaque in how he takes the decision. But when Keir Starmer has changed his mind, he moves really hard and really fast. And I think that's explained by the key difference between him and Jeremy Corbyn, which is Jeremy Corbyn has a whole load of principles and political philosophies and ideological baggage, if you want to put it slightly pejoratively. Keir Starmer has none of that stuff. He has in Tony Blair's words, Tony Blair told us, he didn't start off anywhere apart from vaguely progressive. If that's your sort of grounding, then actually you can find yourself moving pretty quickly when the circumstances demand it.
So Blair's more liquid, is what you're saying. He's a bit more malleable.
Starmer is.
Starmer, sorry.
Sorry, Blair said that about Starmer.
Blair said that about Starmer. Now that we've got that cleared up. There's, in that point in time in the book as well, I suppose Sue Gray is still there and she's observing all of this, and she's like, she doesn't believe there should be a lot of movement in the line, right? She doesn't believe that Starmer should capitulate to the Labour.
She was actually advocating for shadow cabinet members who did want to shift, and she thought she was being sort of shop steward of Muslims in the Parliamentary Labour Party, the left, but also the mayors within the country who maybe slightly more had their fingers on the pulse of the depth of hostility towards Labour's stance.
Right.
She was sort of assuring people, I get that Starmer's been surrounded by this coterie of blokes. They were quite helpful bogeymen at a time. She was saying, well, listen, I'll talk to him, we'll shift this. And I think it only confirms how much this emanated from Starmer himself, that Gray was one of the many people who went to see Starmer during this time, who left empty-handed.
But as ever with Sue, it's quite hard to get to the bottom of whether that's her just saying to someone, for relationship management purposes, don't worry, I'll speak to Keir, it's going to be fine, and they're never doing the sort of Andy Burnham and Sadiq would really like a ceasefire bit. And that sort of recurs a bit in Sue Gray. It's sort of, the number of cabinet ministers who say, I came to Sue and said, this thing needs to be sorted tomorrow, and she's like, yeah, I'll sort it. I'll speak to Keir.
It's interesting, isn't it? And then you don't know then whether, if she does make that representation, if she's sort of being allowed by her political opponents within that inner circle to thrash around in that way, knowing someone who knows Starmer's mind perhaps a little closer, that he is not going to move on this, and therefore you can make those representations all you like, he's not going to shift. In the same way, they get into government and then she's allowed to make a bit of a mess, because at the end of the day it means she will eventually be...
Well, they needed her to fail. I think that's the truth. People say, why was Labour's first 100 days in government so chaotic? It's like, well, actually, to a certain extent, some people needed them to be. Because Sue Gray they were already locked in. Sue Gray they couldn't on the eve of the election say to Keir Starmer, actually, can we sack Sue Gray now? They missed their window to sack Sue Gray in opposition, or say to Keir Starmer this wasn't working. So basically, they sort of had to stumble into government and be like, we either won't intervene to fix this, or in some cases we'll actively make this worse. And it worked, But maybe
At some cost.
Yeah, at some cost.
Yeah.
And actually, you can. Once it got to sort of the election campaign, there was no moving Sue Gray. But if they really thought Sue Gray was going to be a disaster, then they probably should have moved her earlier. I mean, we were having conversations for the book in January where people were correctly predicting, we think Sue's going to be a disaster and we wish she would leave now. And these were sort of quite senior people, and you sort of think, well, don't you have an in?
Well, we had one conversation, you remember, with an unnamed individual who said that they thought that Starmer's decision to stick with her could cost Labour the election. I mean,
Wow.
I think we emerged thinking, well, that's mildly preposterous, but okay. But, it is true that one of the riddles of the book is how it was that the man who we were saying wouldn't chair his first meeting, but was adamant that notes be kept, that they adhere to the law, etc. How do you reconcile that Starmer with the Starmer that enabled a divided operation to enter into government, also without having completed the preparation that they spent months hitting members of our profession over the head with as having been better than anything that had ever come before? I mean, the cupboard was basically bare last July.
And they knew as well, like the polling was pretty clear, right? Pretty much everyone in the country knew, barring an explosion, Labour is going to be the next government, right? So it's not like they're caught off guard, other than with the timing of the election.
I mean, and just as a little vignette, so Starmer's Director of Communications didn't know that he'd have a job until 4 p.m. of polling day itself, which was why there was literally no plan for what he would do on the day that he won. And this individual cobbled together on a back of a fag packet a plan for Starmer to do a sort of fairly perfunctory tour of the regions and nations. But this stuff was literally planned after
Ollie Reader
the
in the back of a
election.
taxi, that isn't it?
Yeah.
Regions and nations tour. We'll get the PM out.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Chat GPT, how do I do the first 100 days? But you actually think, and I'm not, again, like, we don't want to fall foul of the very Westminster critique that, they didn't fill the grid, and, if only the grid had been done, then everything would have been sorted. The one thing you could say about Stalin was he filled his grid. It's like, there is more to life than that, but it is true that they actually had not populated even the first week with any detail as to what they would do. And I don't think we really understand how that was allowed to happen.
I think that we should, I know you're going to have to go soon, but I really want to ask you about Angela Rayner, because she's, and the sort of the relationship that she had with Starmer, because you go right back to when they're both elected him as leader and her as deputy, and the decisions that she makes at that time about them being a joint enterprise, very different to how Tom Watson had acted when he was in that position. And there's this line that you have about Tom Watson putting his office near the parliamentary press gallery.
Yeah.
And whereas Angela Rayner takes the old room where Seamus Milne and Andrew Fisher used to pore over policy, and that was sort of in a bid to be a joint unit at the top. And I wonder, like, how well do you think that relationship has endured? Do you think that they still see each other as a joint enterprise, or do you think that they're sort of at the whim of the membership and she is going to stay in that position because she has to?
I don't think people around Keir Starmer ever saw it as a joint enterprise in the way that Angela Rayner did. Now, whether Keir Starmer initially saw it as a joint enterprise is another question. I think what people close to Angela Rayner say was that during that first year, Keir Starmer would be constructive. He'd say, yeah, I really want to be a joint enterprise. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And then Angela Rayner's team would try and give effect to that. And it would be a case of, mañana, there's a long email thread, but you're not on it. Go away, basically, is how they recall it. And that obviously all comes to a head in Hartlepool in 2021, where the idea that they could be equal partners, friends, whatever, I think is completely blown up. But what that does facilitate, and I think both Angela Rayner's team and people who were working for Keir at the time say this, is that it allowed them to rebuild their relationship a bit more honestly, i.e. the sort of pretense that they were a joint premiership, or that, they wanted to bring Angela Rayner right into the centre of things, was, that was blown up by the way Keir Starmer tried to get rid of her and the way Angela Rayner responded. But then they could go forward with a sort of more acute understanding of each other's strengths. And it's certainly true that throughout this story, when Keir Starmer's back is really up against the wall, often it is Angela Rayner he turns to, despite the fact there's a fair degree of mutual suspicion and I wouldn't put it as strong as dislike, but certainly there's not a whole lot of love there, even if there's a begrudging respect between the two teams. And who does Keir Starmer call when he needs to elect his chairman of the NEC? It's Angela Rayner. Who does Keir Starmer call when during the election campaign all anyone is talking about for a week is Dan Abbott, and Keir Starmer needs the cover to let Dan Abbott stand? He says to Angela Rayner, please can you do this intervention, it'll look like it's spontaneous and I'll have no option but to fall in behind you. So even if relations aren't good, I mean, as late as February 2022, I think, Angela Rayner is in the pub saying Keir Starmer's going to sack me as deputy because he just wants to and the people around him don't like me. I think Keir Starmer knows he needs Angela Rayner precisely because I think she has a clear political identity that he doesn't. What if this government still has a sort of recognisable strand of sort of social democracy in it? It's probably in Angela Rayner's department and the stuff she's doing, not in number 10. So, it's been a difficult relationship, but certainly one that will endure as long as Keir Starmer is Prime Minister, because without her, I think he lacks an outlet to talk to the Labour Party and navigate really difficult situations on the left.
This is possibly a good point to talk about punching hippies. Because, just to be clear, I will give full credit to that sort of Duncan Robinson piece in The Economist, which really got my mind ticking about factionalism in the Labour Party and to what political end beating your factional opponents within the Labour Party serves. Because very quickly it will come around to seeking a second term when traditionally you rely on your base, and energising your base is essentially whether or not you stay in office. So to what end does possibly trying to depose Angela Rayner in 21 or marginalising and sidelining her at different moments, leaving her really as one of the sort of the key holdouts of social democracy, or at least sort of the left of the Labour Party within your cabinet and attacking others? Like, what is the purpose of that for Keir Starmer? Is it because it feels good? Is it because it does serve a political function? Is it because McSweeney and others have understood that in order to exert control in the Labour Party, you have to fight this factional battle, and whoever wins it holds the keys to power? Like, how do you guys understand the purpose of that exercise? And I guess within the context of Angela Rayner as well.
So, look, I don't want to, in answering your question, accept the premise that this is the only way to do politics. But if you look at contemporary British political history, well, there aren't that many times that Labour's gotten into power full stop. And when they have tended to ritually disembowel the left for the purpose of the British public's understanding that they're not deranged as they would perceive it. And that was exactly what McSweeney had always intended to do, that we have to engage. It's actually amusing, he loathes performative politics on the left, but he wanted to engage in a performance for the benefit of the public, which is we are going to decapitate Corbyn and do everything we can to humiliate him such that we can face the public and say, we're different now and you can trust us. I mean, there is a sort of folk idea within the party that the British public just is much more small c conservative than we tend to appreciate. And so the only way to get to power is to disavow leftism. I mean, Starmer, I think, ended up alighting on a similar conclusion for different reasons, which was that he just detested the gross ineptitude and incompetence of Corbyn and felt that it actually ended up being morally inadequate as well. Because, for instance, when Starmer had spent months fine-tuning his response to the Equalities Commission's inquiry into anti-Semitism and preparing to try and press the reset button with British Jewry, Corbyn, moments after the report had landed, published this statement basically sort of semi-apologising but also issuing a version of his defence. And Starmer just thought, well, I don't know how that's happened. We've written at some length about the tensions within Corbyn's operation. His wife, as some of the days would perceive it, pouring poison into his ear, telling him, Jeremy, you've got nothing to apologise for. Seamus Milne and Carrie Murphy, among others, trying to let Corbyn sort of exit the centre stage with some dignity, saying, there will be a time to give your position, but it's not now. And we ought to not do anything that could imperil you and the left's position long term. For whatever reason, Corbyn was allowed to basically put a bomb under that day. And I think Starmer emerged with the sense that, well, I just can't do business with these people. Not the same moral disgust at the left that McSweeney had, but I cannot do business with people. I can't deal with this level of incompetence. And again, maybe incompetence is how he perceives politics full stop, because he was equally pissed off with Angela Rayner when, after the botched Hartlepool reshuffle, Rayner was in the pub. Her allies were briefing a leadership contest. She was trying to hold a gun to the party's head on which jobs she would accept. And Starmer was like, I'm going home. I'll come back when she's made up her mind about what she'll accept, but I'm not doing this. So in the end, you could say that, Starmer and McSweeney's, not only their paths become aligned, but their philosophies become entwined, but for very different reasons.
I'm probably running out of time, so I'll probably just say or ask, what do McSweeney and Starmer think of the book? You giving them a copy? They've given you feedback yet?
No.
That's all they said. No, full stop.
Probably. I mean, Keir Starmer's not been asked about it yet. He'd be very welcome to a signed copy if he wants one. I don't know what Morgan McSweeney thinks. And I suspect we might never find out.
About anything.
Yeah. But look, I think... look, you mentioned Andrew Rawnsley at the start of this discussion. I mean, his second book alleged that the Prime Minister was in the habit of punching people, throwing printers and phones at them, and, once, grabbed one of his closest aides by the lapels. I mean, I think that in terms of negativity vis-a-vis Keir Starmer, this is a couple of notches down in terms of his personal life and habits. So
it's like how you run this ship, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
as you said, some people like going on the DLR.
Yeah, exactly. Campbell, won't be here again. Guys, thank you so much for coming in to talk to us about it.
There really is like a piece of information in every paragraph.
Oh, thank you.
It's such a good read.
Thank you so
honestly.
much. Thank you.
Yeah.
A glowing endorsement.
They're like, cut that out.
Get in. Thank you, guys. Patrick Maguire, Gabriel Pogrund. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.